We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today and recognise that these are places where learning has always taken place through storytelling and the sharing of experiences. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anthony and it's my pleasure to welcome you, where we're going to be talking today about the roadmap for achieving net zero for commercial properties. That acknowledgement of country does talk about sharing of experiences through storytelling and sharing. So please, if you have questions, send them through via the Q&A. And if they're for a specific person, please address them to that person so we can make sure we get the right person answering your question. But today, we're going to jump straight in pretty quickly, but I just want to introduce our four panelists for today. Our first panelist for today is Magali Wardle, the Head of Market Development at NABERS. Welcome, Magali.
Thanks, great to be here today.
We have Ruben Langbroek, the Head of Asia Pacific for GRESB. Welcome, Ruben. Steve Ford, the Head of Sustainability and Energy at the GPT Group. G'day, Steve. And last but not least, the founder and CEO of CIM, Dave Walsh. G'day, Dave.
Oh yeah.
We're going to jump straight in with Dave. You will see a bit of an overview of the main strategies that make up the net zero roadmap that we're going to cover up with our panel today. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Look, there's an awful lot of ambitious targets being put there by all the major owners, and realistically, it's a pretty well beaten path at this stage. I mean, it's really kind of step number one is to get the most out of what you've already got. So that's a case of optimization and monitoring, and really ensuring that all the processes and all the existing plant and equipment within an asset is running as well as it can. The next step then is just really to pick the most suitable equipment upgrades based on energy efficiency and carbon emissions, and also to ensure that you're working with the supply chain consultants and various different manufacturers to ensure that all that equipment is not just sized correctly, but also installed and commissioned and operating to its fullest capability. After that, you kind of have to look to alternative sources of energy. It's in the commercial space. Obviously, various different types are limited given the types of assets you have. But then after that, it's power purchase agreements, right? It's how you can buy offsets. And I think the key thing with a lot of the various different indices and benchmarks that are out there, and even with the owners, they typically like to get the most out of what they have and pick the best equipment before immediately rushing to expensive power purchase agreements. So I think that's kind of the path that I see most people going. It's kind of the most logical one. Yeah, and I'm happy to hear the rest of the panelists' thoughts on it.
Awesome. So, Ruben, there's been some recent changes to the 2023 GRESB standards that have enabled GRESB to monitor net zero progress and track information on net zero policies, commitments and targets for the first time. Can you talk us through some of those findings?
Yeah, sure, and thanks. Obviously, net zero is on top of mind of also our stakeholders globally. So typically we serve large institutional investors that want to invest responsibly, and of course also want to decarbonize the investments in their portfolios. So the way how the GRESB standards are developed is by a separate independent foundation owned by the industry, and they determine how the GRESB standard should recognize net zero, either let's say policies, targets, readiness, and of course achievements. The issue there is that currently there's no global consensus around what defines net zero for buildings. Especially if you look at different stakeholders, asset owners, asset managers, and other stakeholders that are involved. So what the standards have done this year, importantly, is while we're trying to get to a better way of measuring net zero achievements and outcomes, to already reward actions that would enable those outcomes and get to net zero faster. So this year, we looked at the presence of net zero policies, public commitments, as well as targets, and looked globally, etc., what the real estate industry already is doing. And if you talk about the results, it's quite promising to see that Australia, well, I think it's smashing it at the global level. 93% of the real estate companies in Oceania have a net zero policy. 83% have public commitments and 80% have targets. If you compare it to the global average, that's really quite a bit low, not just a few basis points. So I guess it shows that there's a strong commitment from the industry here to get to net zero. And while we, with our stakeholders, are trying to determine how we're gonna measure, benchmark, and score that, at least it shows that we can already see what's happening in terms of actionable items that are being incorporated across real estate organizations.
Always good to hear Australia leading the way.
As always.
So, Steve, property companies in Australia and Asia continue to excel, as we've just heard from Ruben there, when it comes to sustainable real estate. Why do you think the region's doing so well? Like, what's underneath all of that?
We have some structural advantages, no doubt about that. I think Dave hit the nail on the head. It is a well-trodden path, a net zero plan in Australia. So it's great to see that GRESB has made some progress towards recognising a plan to, in the future, deliver net zero. But the reality is many of us have already delivered for parts or whole portfolios net zero certified independent outcomes. So I'd really love to see the GRESBs of this world actually take that step a bit further and recognising performance net zero. We did find it was quite ironic this year. We, for the first time, had certified our shopping centre portfolio assets carbon neutral by the Australian Government's Climate Active program using the NABERS pathway. And having those things in place is that structural advantage we talk about. You know, NABERS has been driving good disclosure and accurate, consistent, assessment of performance since the noughties. Yet we're talking here 20 years later about, is there a global consensus for what net zero is when you have PAS 2060 used all over the world or climate active in Australia? So by having things like NABERS, you have a whole load of consultants, you have a whole load of building owners that actually start to understand energy a little bit more, water a little bit more. You have an efficient process by which you can actually independently validate things against the standard basis of preparation. So whilst I think on international benchmarking, there's a long way to go for the recognition of things that we're already doing as a well-trodden path. And I couldn't have described it much better, Dave. What you described earlier was essentially our approach, although we did start one step earlier, measure everything first. And that's where NABERS comes in as well. So, well done, NABERS. You don't have to speak about yourselves doing anything good at all, because I always do. So, but that sort of structure is great, and also the collaboration. We often co-own buildings, so what I learn, my co-owners learn, and we share within our industry, even though we compete very hard against each other as well.
So, Magali, Steve's kind of talked up NABERS a little bit and given you a nice little wrap there. Well, what's the focus for NABERS over the near term?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And it's great to hear, the progress that the Australian property sector has already made, and how NABERS is helping to support that kind of measurement and management of the buildings where it operates. So we've got a really busy year ahead at NABERS, and one of the things that we're focusing on right now is expanding our offering to more and more building types. So we have a very ambitious expansion roadmap. So in the sort of early 2024, we're going to be launching a rating for schools, and we'll be branching into the retail sector in the middle of next year. And in addition to that, we're also working on this product that we're calling the Universal Benchmark. It's a working title at the moment, so welcome any suggestions for some different names. And essentially what that is an option for buildings for which a NABERS rating doesn't currently exist, and actually may never exist because the building is quite a niche building, or there aren't very many of them. And what it will be is like a verified energy and emissions intensity, which will give that building a way to compare itself against similar buildings and also track progress over time, which is really important when we're talking about this net zero trajectory. And in addition to that, our 5-year strategic plan is just coming to an end this current financial year. So we're developing the next one. And we we've got 3 goals in mind at the moment. The first one being around growing participation across all building types and rating types within NABERS. The next one is about improving performance, because once you start to measure your building performance, the next thing you need to do is improve on that to get the impact that we need. And the final goal that we're looking at is around evolution. So making sure that NABERS continues to work for industry and stays relevant and impactful in such a dynamic sort of environment. So I'm just going to do a really quick plug. We actually have a public consultation open for our strategic plan at the moment. So we'd love to hear what you think. So yeah, please check out our website.
Awesome. Thanks, Magali. That's really, really cool. I love that, it's not just about one type of building or one class of buildings, but you're actually now diversifying across all sorts of different sorts of buildings and even looking for the ones that don't fit anywhere. I think that's really important as well. So, Dave, you mentioned in your introduction the importance of monitoring and optimizing the equipment you already have and really, sweating those assets. Why is monitoring and optimization so foundational for a net zero strategy?
Yeah, and it goes back to the oldest one in the books, which is, you can't manage something you're not measuring, right? So it's a business process, Anthony. I originally, in the sense that this type of stuff happens has been happening, in lots of other areas of business since forever, right? But in buildings, it has been complex. The initial way that people kind of tried to do it was utility bill analysis, but that's kind of looking at your energy consumption in the rear view mirror, because invariably by the time you look at the bill, the event has happened. So then the industry kind of took the next step to electricity sub-metering and kind of additional sensors. And that was good. It helped with environmental ratings. But then the kind of next step below that is the ability to actually listen to the plant and equipment and do fault detection and diagnosis. And what that allows, kind of where that pays into net zero is that it's not just, let's say, a 20% electricity saving and 16% like kind of gas saving, which is kind of our typical numbers for property owners, but it actually helps the operation teams within the assets to kind of extend the life cycle of expensive plant and equipment. And when you think of the embodied energy in a new chiller or pump, if you can get an existing piece of equipment that's performs pretty well, to extend the life cycle of it for 3 or 4 years, well, then you offset the need for an additional kind of manufacture of a new piece of equipment. So you're able to improve equipment life cycle. You're also, importantly, when you carry out advanced monitoring of buildings, you're able to reduce tenant hot and cold complaints. And one of our clients, before we started with them, 60% of their tenant complaints were air conditioning related. And also air conditioning tends to be the largest energy user in assets. So therefore, if you're able to get in and monitor the performance of these assets, and you're able to identify the root cause of problems and give that to the relevant contractor, what happens is people find and fix technical problems faster. And that then means that it improves everything within the operation of complex portfolios, right? I mean, to do it on one building is one thing, but to do it across dozens and dozens of buildings is not easy. But what the industry has shown between NABERS and GRESB is that the people, the companies who are doing this the best tend also to be the top of other areas, because sustainability and net zero tends to be an early indicator of overall performance, including in financial performance. So the net outcome of this stuff is transitioning a business to net zero, but the way it has to happen is kind of helping those people operating a large complex building like a shopping center, a museum, a large office block, a casino, a hospital, to help them find and fix technical problems faster. And the only way to do it is just with good measurement and monitoring of the assets.
There's a really strong angle in that too, that when you get this stuff right, it leads the rest of the business. It's not an anchor that's dragging things backwards. It's actually a leader that's dragging everything up. When you talk about improved financial performance, better maintenance, and all those sorts of other things, better management of CapEx and so on. So it actually drags you up, not slows you down. I think that's a really powerful observation. But Steve, at GPT, your sustainability team works with your ops team pretty closely. Can you talk a little bit about how they work together and how that's successful?
Yeah, all the data analytics in the world is no use unless someone acts on it. And I think we were probably one of Dave's first customers a long time ago in Wollongong. And I remember catching up with him and trying to work out how do we make sure we don't only optimize our buildings or have information to optimize our buildings, we optimize a process so it's enacted all the time, every time. And we found at first leaving it just with the ops team didn't necessarily have the firepower to get them to act on good advice. So we now actually work very closely with what we call our building performance team, which is external service providers like CIM, the operations team, and then reporting into the operations team, we've got mechanical contractors and BMS contractors. And really, we leverage the information that we get from our platforms and then manage our ops managers to manage their contractors to get it done. So it is a big team effort, and you take any one element out of it, you're going to have a situation where you've got good information about what you could optimize, but not the most optimized outcomes or the most efficient way of getting those outcomes.
Yeah, that's really great. So Magali, sorry, as ops teams execute optimizations, what role do rating systems like NABERS actually play? Like, do people look at them? Are they a big deal, or is it just another thing that the board wants to see?
I mean, I think that one of the strengths of NABERS is it's such a simple star rating that really gives that common language that everybody understands. It's much easier to understand 5 stars than 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared or something like that. So, and I think another really good strength of NABERS ratings is that they actually assess the operational performance of the building. It's not like a tick box exercise to say, yes, I've got all of these technologies. And so it really allows building managers to actually choose the technology that works best for their particular building. And then it's that kind of measurement management cycle that we've heard David talking about earlier. So the rating, first of all, can be used to set that baseline and then track performance over time. And it also normalizes for things like operating hours and occupancy levels. So you can really understand how well the optimizations of your like new technologies and your energy efficiency improvements are actually working. For instance, like I just read a case study about a building that moved from about 1.5 stars to 5-star NABER rating. And they did that by implementing a series of energy efficiency upgrades and then using their building management system to really optimize the performance of all of that new equipment to get the best out of those investments that they've made and made sure that they were delivering maximum energy efficiency. So I think that attention to detail that we've just heard Steve talking about and making people accountable for how those technologies run, you see the outcome with a well-rated NABERS rating.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love, that's the simplicity is when I look at 4-star and 4-star, I know that I've got a normalized comparison, even though those two buildings might be quite different.
Yeah.
So Ruben, GRESB assessments offer participants a scorecard benchmark report with the actions they can take to improve their ESG performance. Just thinking about that performance bit of the benchmark, what are some of the operational improvements that typically form part of those insights?
I'm happy to jump on the bandwagon of if you can measure it, you can manage it, and if you can manage it, you can improve it. So data coverage. We've seen that by rewarding data coverage of portfolios in terms of operational performance metrics, so energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions across different scopes, water waste, that indeed the building owners and landlords that we are assessing have been able to improve the performance of their assets just by understanding what's happening both within the base building as well as in tenant spaces. In relation to the latter, obviously we understand that getting tenant data can be a challenge depending on the jurisdiction which you're in, such as here in Australia. But because GRESB takes an asset owner's point of view, where the institutional investors that invest in either listed companies or private funds, so via the property groups, they would like to understand and of course decarbonize the emissions that are part of their equity portfolio. So We've been incentivizing reporting companies around the globe to report on tenancies as well. And by way of doing so, we've seen increased exchange of information flows. That again allows the building owner to better understand what the footprint is and then take according action as well. So I would say data coverage and understanding what the potential is of your building probably comes first. But of course, then you're not talking just about environmental performance, but actually about stakeholder engagement. So indeed, how can you collaborate with different tenants to make sure that A, they understand your own ambitions or objectives, and then B, to make sure they are aligned and help them with sustainable fit out or fit out ratings by NABERS, anyone else, the use of renewables if possible, and just addressing any other emission concerns. So I think that that's a very strong aspect of our assessment and the standards as well, to make sure that we don't just look at actions that directly relate to reducing your footprint, but also what are the enabling actions by engaging with different stakeholders that are part of the entire supply chain.
I think Peter Drucker, if he was still with us, would be jumping up and down with joy at everyone quoting his "you can't manage what you can't measure" line. He would love that. So Steve, let's talk a little bit about energy itself, and the need for a lot of buildings to upgrade and electrify a lot of operations. Can you talk us through GPT's strategy when it comes to selecting where to invest your CapEx upgrades across the retail and office portfolios that you manage?
Yeah, look, I think for us, there's not that many low-hanging fruit. We've been on this journey for close to 20 years. So, starting with, the simplest part was turning stuff off, then optimizing it, and then the final step is, change it for something that works a bit better. And the best time to change something for something that works a bit better is at a life cycle opportunity. Otherwise, you're basically spending a whole load of capital on something that is unplanned, has a lot of life left in it. And believe me, there are plenty of life cycle opportunities in the average asset. So we have years to plan for that. We know when it's coming up. We have plenty of platforms to do it, and you get the best paybacks because you're talking about only considering a delta. So the cost of a like-for-like versus the cost of an upgrade, that delta between those two costs versus an out of life cycle upgrade where you actually consider the entire cost in your returns. So that's our approach in general. Unless you've got a business case where out of life cycle can meet our normal internal rate of return requirements, and there are still plenty of those out there. I guess when it comes to the lower cost items like your lighting, we're on in some assets our third generation of LED lights that are being done on just a payback analysis, but the big plant and equipment's done over the life cycle.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? Because some of the assets are just so capital intensive that you've got to make sure you get maximum value, which is why the monitoring and management is so important of those assets, so that you get the maximum value over their life cycle before you take a life cycle replacement to further boost things along. Magali, NABERS recently launched its renewable energy indicator, rewarding fully electrified buildings. What should owners know about this new indicator? What do you predict its impact will be?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. We were really pleased to launch the Renewable Energy Indicator earlier this year, and it followed a couple of years of industry consultation where we were really trying to understand how we could better recognise the broad use of renewable energy in buildings and also start to change that behaviour change towards full electrification. So essentially what it is it's a percentage figure that indicates how much of the energy consumed by the building comes from renewable sources. As I said, it was designed to recognise a broader range of renewable energy sources because we were hearing from our stakeholders that they wanted to see that. So it sits alongside every NABERS energy rating to give an indication not only of the building energy efficiency, but also its progress towards net zero. So the Renewable Energy Indicator recognises renewable energy from the RET, as well as on-site renewables and procurement of renewables through the retirement of LGCs. So as it stands, the only way to actually get a 100% renewable energy indicator for a building is for it to be fully electric and sourcing 100% renewable energy. So in this way, the REI is incentivising that move away from fossil fuels as well. In terms of the impact that we expect to see, so I think as it is becoming more and more common, as everyone's getting their energy ratings through the year, we're expecting to see the renewable energy indicator to start being weaved into all kinds of initiatives. You know, it could be anything from policy mechanisms to green leases, as a way to encourage buildings that are taking that step away from fossil fuels and using renewable energy as much as they can. That said, you know, we're kind of tracking the renewable energy indicator figures as they come in. So it launched in June this year, and I just had a quick look today, and the average score for offices and shopping centres is around 28%. So that means there's still an awful lot of room for improvement, but at least we have a baseline now and we know where we're starting from.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in for the audience. So this is the fun bit for our panelists, because this is where they don't know what's coming next. I'm going to start off with a question for Steve. So a question for Steve is, how does GPT balance energy efficiency with tenant comfort and experience?
I think very well. You don't have to, that doesn't have to be a trade-off. And I think that's one of the misnomers that people have put out there is, you know, blame the sustainability guys when something goes wrong with comfort conditions. In fact, a very well-run, optimized building will improve both your efficiency and your tenant comfort. You know, it is about knowing your conditions across the board and understanding the most efficient way of achieving the conditions you want to achieve. And if you're trading off comfort, you're actually failing in half your job.
I would 100% agree with that, just by the way. You know, I would definitely agree that a well-managed building can be energy efficient and have really good thermal comfort. And we don't see necessarily that competition when we see buildings that are getting indoor environment ratings and energy ratings. So yeah, definitely, I think a well-managed building can tick both of those boxes.
I want to
while you've got your
example of something we've done recently. So one of our major shopping centre assets in a warmer than average climate, so it's in Queensland, and it is one that uses the SIM optimization platform. We identified the opportunity to optimize the HVAC performance, and the main area we were targeting was the AHU fans. Got the reports back a month into it, you know, massive savings on the AHU fans, and I sent my team back to the drawing board and I said, well, I want to see what's happening with your chillers and pumps, because you can always trade off your fans for your chillers and pumps. They came back, and we actually also had savings on our chillers and pumps as well. So it was a bigger savings story. I went, okay, now I know exactly what's going to happen is I'm going to have people tell me that you've traded off conditions. So we went back and looked at the conditions. Complaints had reduced, and our data for being within an incredibly tight band was actually tighter than it had been previously. So we were meeting conditions better than we ever had before. And the only conclusion I could have is if you wound down your fans, you wound down your pumps, you wound down your chillers, you're essentially, they were blowing all the cold air straight out to the outside. That doesn't make anyone more comfortable. It just makes you use a whole load of energy to keep your conditions inside when you could actually slow it all down and optimize it. So that's the real life example in just the last 6 months that we've delivered.
That's great. And it's always good to hear an actual real success story and not just a theoretical opportunity for success, but that real success. Magali, we've got a question for you as well that's come in from our audience. Is NABERS planning on expanding the NABERS waste to tenants for, say, retailers over 1,000 square metres and for office tenants over 5,000 square metres?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question? I mean, I think the short answer is we're always looking at ways that we can expand our products to create impact. So I couldn't really commit to saying exactly what's in the plan for our waste tool right now, but it's all about what we do when we decide whether to expand to different sectors. Is we have basically a feasibility study where we look to see what's the market appetite for this tool, what's the size of the impact that it can make from a sustainability factor, and what's the technical considerations. So, you know, we would definitely be looking at from the waste perspective too, to make sure that whatever we expand into next is going to get the kind of the best in terms of impact and create a product that's going to be used in industry.
And I think you've answered the question really well, like that, even though you may not have quite got what I asked you 100%. Dave, just coming back, I mean, so we've heard from Steve, and we've heard from everyone that, you know, you can make upgrades to plants and equipment, but once those are done, what's the role of the continuous data-led monitoring? Where's that fit?
Yeah, I think it's been touched on in a number of different topics, right? Like any business, when you improve the collaboration between teams, everything works better, right? So running a large office or retail asset, and when you can get, Steve touched on all the people that are involved in their team. We have mechanical contractors, a BMS, building management system contractor. You have electricians for lightings, cooling towers. They typically are looked after by plumbers, but that's all external. But then internal, you have an operations team or a performance team or an energy team that are working with those. So technology and software is all about efficiencies. It's all about improving collaboration. And if you can improve that collaboration, and if you can move issues around quite quickly, and if it's easy for somebody like Steve or someone that within Steve's team to see where an issue is, let's say with a pump or a fan or a chiller, then you improve accountability within the supply chain. And what you'll find with better accountability is that it kind of really rewards the mavericks who are within the supply chain and within the existing team. And it also kind of allows people that are managing, let's say, hundreds of people across an estate to be able to pick up the phone and have a discussion with someone who maybe doesn't value the culture of, let's say, whatever real estate investment trust or property owner, if they're not engaging and if they're not rectifying issues. So like good technology improves, it allows things to happen, right? And nothing happens until something's fixed. So creating action, like people talk about climate action, but actual actions within a building is hugely important. It happens through collaboration. For us, we spent years and years at the start working on that visibility, because if the issues aren't visible to people, if it's not easy, because yes, you have technical people involved in these fixes, but very often you have non-technical people. So you have to have a good user interface and user experience. So non-technical people can know enough to know that they have to tap a button for a yes, or say, no, we're not doing it because the tenant is moving out. We'll do it in 6 or 8 weeks' time during the refit. But technology, look, in its nature, all the best technology businesses in the world are all about improving that decision-making through improved collaboration, right? So that's what we focus on. The likes of GPT use it really well and push this hard from the very, very start. And that actually is very reflective. Now I've moved to the US, and I can really see just how far advanced the Australian property sector is compared to some of the discussions I have here. I think the likes of NABERS, the likes of GRESB have had a huge part to play in it. I think Steve touched on the environment there, right? It's very kind of collaborative across, because there's lots of co-ownership, but then it's also very competitive, and it's a really healthy competition within the Australian property sector. And when you mix it with the kind of the remote nature of the different regions, I think, you know, I every single time I look at and I study the GRESB results, it's amazing to see the results, the position that the Australian companies occupy in it and have done for years.
Yeah, I would like to fully agree with that and make a remark, because I think it's a very unique mindset here in Australia, where on one hand there's a very strong competition in terms of, you know, being the best and excelling on sustainability. And I know, because every year when we release the GRESB results, my phone doesn't stop ringing for the first week, because everyone's like, why did I drop from rank number 1 to 2 or 3 within my peer group, even though we did better? which is great because I think that inspires others to also join and just do better and lift the bar for the industry as a whole. But similarly, there is indeed a very high degree of collaboration, as you mentioned, David. And that combination, so competition and collaboration, I think is very unique, and we don't see it happening anywhere else. And so we know, for example, GPT developed an operational waste standard, and instead of keeping that for themselves, they gave it back to the industry, which is now NABERS waste, for everyone to use and to understand how to better, understand waste streams and measure the right metrics and so on. And again, I think it's a very unique combination of competition, collaboration, with the ability, again, to raise the bar for the industry as a whole and just do better on all things sustainability.
While you've got the microphone on, Ruben, in your experience, what renewable energy trends are the most influential in improving GRESB scores for real estate assets?
Renewable energy, well, I think very much aligned with Magali has mentioned regarding NABERS. We see it at the global level. Obviously, if you talk about renewable energy, it comes after implementing efficiencies and make sure your buildings perform at the highest level of efficiency. Of course, electrification, an important one, and then renewable energy, either generated and used on-site or off-site. And also there, it's important to recognize that, and Steve knows that, in an urban area, there might not be that much capacity to generate energy on-site. So we look in general, let's say, what the different real estate portfolios and managers are doing. And we do see some increase in renewables, but perhaps not as much as you would expect. So I think Magali said their score for renewable energy is 28, probably out of 100. I think if we would translate that to, let's say, the global GRESB score, it's similar, slightly lower, again, because we know that Australia does well. What is important, and also what we changed in the standard this year, is to reward actively procured renewable energy. So not just being energy coming from a green grid or a grid that gets greener and less carbon intensive. But again, it's about actions and intentionality, which we should award, and not just the fact that in the end grids will decarbonize. And then we also looked at some other upcoming topics, such as how to score energy consumed by EV chargers on site. What about buildings that have been designed with on-site low carbon technologies? And we've seen some very interesting pilots being run also here in Australia, where let's say the property group, in collaboration with the contractors and the builder, just try to reduce the carbon footprint of the construction activities. So again, using electricity on site, even renewables, of course, thinking about embodied and upfront carbon at the same time. So I would say there's lots of innovative approaches and thinking that's currently happening. And I would say without that, we're going to see the results of that in the likes of, let's say, NABERS ratings, but also in the GRESB scores in the years to come.
This is an area that Ruben and I have had many robust discussion over. I think it's great.
Yeah,
yeah, robust. NABERS in 2019 adopted alignment with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's market-based accounting, which does recognise off-site renewable energy procurement, which drives a greener grid. Essentially, if you don't have anyone to buy the renewables and pay that premium, you are never going to get a greener grid. And it's an area that, I'd invite the rest of the property industry and investors, if there's any online, to challenge GRESB on to include in their recognition for performance. The same asset that was carbon neutral certified this year or last year, that introduced a large 2 megawatt-hour battery to also help balance the grid in times of supply constraints, got its worst performance score on greenhouse gas emissions, even though it was certified carbon neutral. And one of the principal drivers was that GRESB will not recognise off-site renewable purchases in their performance score for greenhouse gas emissions. So those are the sorts of things that we need to get together and drive the benchmarks to do a better job on. I totally understand that when you're a one out, that you're not going to get that recognition in a benchmark, because benchmarks have to cover the worst to the best. But what that 28% average says that Magali mentioned earlier is a lot of people are doing something with voluntary renewable purchases in Australia. Some are doing a lot. GPT has 100% renewables across all of its assets, although not necessarily yet recognised in GRESB. But you need to get with the times. Those protocols were developed in 2015, and it's 2023. By the time they're recognised in terms of performance, if you wait until they're recognised, job's going to be over, and we need to really drive that one.
Yeah. No, I agree. And as I mentioned in my indeed very robust conversations with Steve, the challenge for GRESB is, I think the challenge is very similar to NABERS, but we have to replicate that success at a global scale with very different views across jurisdictions, very different views across different stakeholders. Again, mentioned financial institutions versus people on the ground that manage and operate buildings. They speak a very different language, and GRESB started to exist with the purpose to create a common language. But that language obviously has evolved, and also the needs in terms of what dialects people want to speak have evolved. And so we're now trying to get back to the drawing board and say, okay, so what defines net zero? Does that indeed include the use of offsets, even though that indeed they have been certified by let's say a great scheme? And when we have this conversation, those again happens not necessarily with us, but under the GRESB Foundation. So that's the industry stakeholders that need to create consensus. It's interesting to see how different views and sometimes very opposing views do not allow for us to make the progress that we need as an industry, and also we need to be able to provide the value that we've been providing our stakeholders since the early days of GRESB. So it is of highest priority, and Steve knows, we always invite our stakeholders to have those constructive conversations, which indeed sometimes might be a bit robust, because it is too important to just say, okay, we can't do anything and we'll just let it be how it currently is. That's not what the call to action is, right? The call to action is to excel and to strive and do better and take action and do more than just commitments, or make more than just commitments, but deliver those outcomes. So for us, the challenge will be, okay, how do we, again, at the global level, recognize excellence and outcomes where all stakeholders more or less at least agree that indeed that's the way that we should assess it. So that's our mission. That's work in progress. But I can tell you that's of the highest priority currently for the GRESB Foundation and our stakeholders.
A quick question for you, Steve.
The 2015 greenhouse gas protocols.
Yeah.
So a quick question for you, Steve. This was something that Ruben mentioned in passing in some of his comments, but you guys have obviously got your diversified portfolio. What's your approach to developing renewable energy on-site versus off-site?
Yeah, so in office, we've maxed out every square metre we can. We're not going to do any more. I'm not going to, put ridiculous targets for things that don't have a payback and they're completely impractical. In retail, as opportunities arrive, and these are things that are often done now with the upgrades of roof as we hit some 50-year roofing upgrade cycles, but there is still some growth opportunity there. And then in logistics, which is the largest amount of roof and the largest number of assets we own, it's something like 70 assets. We need to develop, and we have developed with our partners, Shell Energy Australia, a tenant offer, because we don't actually use energy inside the logistics buildings. It's the tenants that have 100% control of how much they use when they use it. So we've come to our tenants with a zero capital option, so they can get solar arrays on their roof, which when you've got an average lease of 5 years, you're not going to, as a tenant, invest in that. And when it's got with make good clauses about a 12-year payback. So we'll put it on there and essentially put a power purchase agreement in place with the tenants at a rate that's lower than what they're paying for on the grid. So they save money, reduce emissions, have no risk in terms of cost of capital or make good at the end. We've got some tenants making up to 50% savings on their energy bills with that offer. But we've also got a lot of tenants with clearly modelled, and it's very sophisticated modelling, potential savings of 50%, but they don't want to take it up because they believe there's a catch. So it is an interesting one where you can lead a horse to water, You can gather the data all you like, but at the end of the day, tenants are independent decision makers in their operations. And we need to make sure we do what NABERS worked out in the early noughties, which is separate that control and influence. And that's why they've been such a successful tool, is they make people focus on the areas that they actually have control over. When you get your stuff in order that you've got control over, then you'll always have a lot more influence than speaking from a position of, do what I say, not what I do.
Just very quickly, Magali, we just have a quick question for you. Could someone's just asking from our audience if you could please repeat the rating type or name for atypical buildings, or where there are very few buildings of that type?
Yeah,
person who's asking works at an airport and wants to know if that rating would work for airports.
The short answer is yes. We haven't actually got the official title yet, so we're currently calling it the universal benchmark. But as we kind of develop the design of that tool, it'll probably be renamed. But yeah, airports is an excellent example of a building type that uses lots of energy, but there aren't really enough of them for us to have enough data points to actually create a full NABERS benchmark. So yeah, perfect example.
I just
There's obviously a world of difference. So, yeah, go on, Steve.
NABERS ratings aren't always going to be a perfect thing to compare one building to another. We've got some retail assets that have a railway station inside, not going to compare well to an average retail asset. But NABERS ratings are still of enormous value because I can compare the performance of that asset 1 year versus the next, versus the next, versus the next.
Yeah.
Knowing I have a very solid, consistent basis of prep. So even if it's not perfect as a benchmark against other assets, you can benchmark against your own time series.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the other thing with airports, of course, is that there's a market difference between a regional airport and a large international airport, and obviously they're not all the same either. So there's obviously a great deal of diversity across the industry.
That's for sure.
Dave, just coming back to you, Dave. So we've heard quite a bit about the use of renewables from everybody really on the panel. But once renewable energy sources have been invested in, why does technology still matter? Why is it still important?
Yeah, look, I mean, firstly, no matter what size of renewables that you invest in, you want to ensure that the consumption never drifts and that you're able to keep it under like whatever original load you considered for it. And the other use is equally, as you go and upgrade equipment, like it's very important to ensure that that equipment is correctly specified by consultants, like sized. But then even as it's installed and commissioned and integrated with the other equipment within the building, ensuring that it's commissioned correctly and that the investment that a property company makes in a piece of equipment is actually flows through, and you actually get the reduced energy consumption, you get reduced emissions. And that doesn't always happen. And it just comes back to that continuous monitoring. Like if, these buildings are very, very dynamic. We touched on, obviously our technology used across, I think it's nearly 72% of all the premium A-grade shopping centres in Australia, and then 6 out of 10 office trusts. But we also do most of the airports. We do lots of really dynamic assets like casinos and museums. If you take a museum, and we touched on it with comfort levels, but they also have to look at things like relative humidity. Because in a museum environment, if you don't have enough moisture in the air, then artworks can get brittle and crack. And if there's too much moisture, then you'll develop mold. And equally, you'll destroy if it's outside of a relative humidity band. So these assets are really, really dynamic. They're not easy to keep, let's say, like retaining the talent, let's say, that operate the assets. If somebody that's operating a complex assets for GPT or someone leaves, well, you want a certain centralization of the knowledge to ensure that the next person that comes along is able to sit into the seat and actually run that asset to a performance level that was at the previous person's level. And technology, again, helps with that, because there's things that you want decentralized, like trips and spills and OH&S issues. They have to be dealt with at a regional and asset level. But technology deployments typically happen at head office, and they're typically standardized, which means that you can get a consistency. And as Steve said, there's different types of assets with train stations and different regions, so they're not all per square meter, they're not all equally kind of benchmarkable. But at the same time, there is consistencies that technology can deliver across portfolios that without it, you're essentially flying blind.
Steve, can I just another question from the audience, and hopefully you can answer this in about 30 seconds so that we can stay on schedule and make sure we get through the rest of the stuff we want to get through for this webinar. Has GPT seen impact on energy consumption driven by on-site EV chargers?
Yes.
There you go. I got 28 of my seconds back there. Thanks very much. Magali, can you talk us through how NABERS offers a pathway to achieving climate active carbon neutral certification and the role of carbon offsetting in this?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it quite brief because I know we're a bit short on time now. So I think we've already heard everyone talking about the fact that the first thing you need to do is get your building as energy efficient as possible, and then as much as possible procure renewable energy for that electricity that you use. But there's still going to be some remaining carbon footprint associated with that building, which you can offset through the climate active pathway. So as Steve already touched on, NABERS does offer a climate active pathway for carbon neutral certification, and it's available for offices, hotels and shopping centres, and we're actually just about to offer it for warehouses and cold stores too. So you access the pathway through your NABERS energy rating, and essentially then you work with your NABERS assessor who helps to quantify the carbon footprint of the building by looking at energy, water, waste and refrigerants. And that the assessor will also verify that then the building owner has procured the correct quantity of offsets and that they are, according to the climate active standard. And, we're definitely seeing increased demand for carbon neutral certification over the last few years. And in fact, we're looking into other sectors that we want to branch out into to offer that pathway to our customers.
Steve, with the purchase of carbon offsets, while the purchase of carbon offsets should only be really considered as a last resort for residual emissions, what are GPT's main considerations when it comes to assessing their quality? And do you think Australia needs to do a bit more in improving the quality of available offsets?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's controversy if I state that most Australian offsets are rubbish. There's been plenty of research that demonstrates that, and most of those are mocked up in mandatory schemes. So if you're going to do something for credibility like a carbon neutral certification, in GPT's case, we've eliminated about 80 to 90% of the inherent emissions, which leaves 10 to 20% of the job to be done with offsets. You don't want to undermine your credibility with dodgy offsets. That all being said, the climate active palette for offsets is quite poor. Most of it is associated with schemes that have many, many flaws associated with them. So in GPT's case, we actually do a 2-for-1. So for every tonne of residual emissions, and most of that comes from waste to landfill. Second most would be gas, and then a little bit from water emissions. So we'll offset one from the palette, which is going to be an emissions avoided offset from energy from a jurisdiction where they're still building coal-fired power stations. Not many of those left in the world. And that's not the one we're proud of. The one we're proud of is the Green Fleet offset that we have, which is reforesting areas of Australia with protections on title for 100 years. That leaves a legacy well beyond just sequestering carbon, a massive legacy in biodiversity and ecosystem services for water as well. So I would look at those co-benefits, but I would also look at the carbon accounting and the credibility of the carbon accounting of whether it's ACCU's, Vera or Gold Standard. There's a lot of challenges with the additionality, realness of many of these carbon offsets.
It sounds like a lot of very healthy skepticism to me. Dave, what are some of the approaches to maximise operational excellence so you minimise the need for carbon offsets?
Yeah, look, it comes down to finding and fixing things faster, right? Like, you know, if you look at, for example, with maintenance, right? The standard maintenance process is to go around and check things, do planned maintenance. So you might go into a large building and check 100 sensors to find one faulty one. Like using data, you can do data-driven maintenance, which means the contractor can just go in and find that one broken sensor, fix that, and fix 2 or 3 other things during a site visit. And that's really what creates that additional step change in performance and reduces the hot and cold complaints and really gets the building running as well as it possibly can. And I mean, for owners looking to pick this type of technology, you can always pilot it, right? There's 2 options when you are trying to buy technology, like ours or like anyone else's. It's you either go to tender, or you pick a couple of providers, you create a finish line with a number of different things that people need to deliver, and you give it a very, very short time frame, like, you know, 2 to 3 months, and see who's most suitable out on the paddock. Or alternatively, you go through the tender process, which is also very valuable because you have an independent kind of consultant that would review whatever people put forward. But again, the whole thing is designed, like, now everyone recognizes that there is advantages in using data to run buildings optimally. And I think for a lot of the owners, they're now just trying to find a way to actually engage in that procurement process to ensure they're getting the results that some of the top REITs are getting.
Anthony, just in terms of the distraction of talking about offsets versus efficiencies, you can get the most expensive offsets in Australia with high credibility for $70 a tonne. Some of the cheapest ones that Climate Active will accept for $5 a tonne. But you can eliminate the need for those by saving $200 to $300 a tonne on your energy bills and other associated costs. So it's not cheating to use offsets, it's just craziness to not take the efficiencies that are there. And it's almost a distraction when people say you're cheating. No, believe me, it's just dumb, not cheating.
Yeah, I think David said to me, about 100 times, the cheapest energy you can have is the energy you don't use.
Yeah.
So you don't have to offset it, don't have to do anything about it. If you don't use it, you don't pay for it. It's a pretty simple equation, I think. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes left before our time's up, so I'm going to ask our panelists to do the impossible and answer something very, very quickly. I'm going to ask each of you for one key piece of advice from your own context. So what's the one key piece of advice you'd like to share with everyone here today as they look to accelerate their net zero journey? Magali, maybe with you, what's your one piece of advice?
Well, I think it's really just one word, which is about collaboration. And even in the conversation today, we've just heard that word over and over again, and all these examples of different types of collaboration that are already happening and need to continue to happen for us to reach that net zero goal. So we're talking about landlords and tenants working together. We're talking about asset owners and investors working together in that sustainable finance area. And we're also talking about the examples of building companies collaborating together to share best practice. So I just think that's going to be even more critical in the next, well, as we try and get to our net zero targets.
And Steve, maybe from you, what's a key piece of advice? Maybe a lesson learned from something that didn't quite go the way you'd expected at GPT.
I'm going to go the other angle, which is things that went better than I expected. So it's not just about decarbonisation, it's doing it in a fashion that is orderly and enables others to decarbonise. And that means being more flexible with your loads. I tried for many years to be more flexible with my loads, and I really did push some boundaries in terms of comfort conditions in some horrific complaint episodes. But the technology is actually there now. We can wind down our loads when there's a low penetration of renewables in the morning and afternoon, and we can wind them up in areas where there's a high penetration, middle of the night for wind, middle of the day for solar. So think about demand side flexibility and whole of infrastructure efficiency, not just inside your own doors efficiency.
Ruben, given that GRESB has a global reach, perhaps what can you tell us from what you've seen from overseas as well, in terms of what's that one piece of key advice for reaching net zero?
It's quite challenging to meet the levels of Magali and Steve in terms of their advice because, yeah, I fully agree. Perhaps from a global level and representing an assessment that specifically looks through the asset owner lens, I would say having a holistic approach towards sustainability or ESG in regard to best practices. So obviously it's not just about having a policy or strategy or an ambition. It's about how are you ensuring that those policies are effectively implemented? Are you measuring their effects and impacts? And then are you able to report on the positive outcomes, both in terms of, let's say, more positive environmental or social outcomes or reduction of negative ones? So I would say that would be my advice to our stakeholders, especially those that report to us. And at the same time, for GRESB, obviously would be then to obviously recognize it accordingly, as I mentioned, which will have its challenges, but I'm sure that together with the industry and collaboration, we will definitely get there.
And very quickly from you, Dave, one key piece of advice, maybe around the technology adoption.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think net zero has finally moved from the plant room to the boardroom, right? And the collaboration element that Magali mentioned, that's also very important internally to make sure that operational team and asset management teams are presenting the business case correctly to the finance team to say, look, you know, net zero doesn't have to be a huge cost expenditure. It can be something that will generate profit for the business if it's done correctly.
Well, with that, our time is up. In fact, we're just a minute over, and I hope everyone can indulge us just for that extra minute. So thanks very much to our panelists. Thank you to Magali, Steve, Ruben, and David for today. For everyone who's attending today, we're going to send out a short survey after the webinar ends, and we'd really appreciate if you could complete that, as it helps us make sure that we do an even better job next time around. CIM has also prepared an ebook that you can download freely from the resources tab at CIM's website, which is cim.io, and that's available for free, and that'll help you with some of the advice that you've heard to boost some of the advice that you've heard today throughout the webinar. But with that, thank you to everybody for your contribution, to the audience for your questions and your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which I believe will be in the new year sometime. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.